Hello, everybody. A couple of years ago, we did a great show. I thought it was a great show, at least, with a man called Peter S. Goodman, uh, correspondent, the global economy correspondent, no less, of the New York Times. He had a book out back in January of 2022 entitled Davos Man, How the Billionaires Devoured the World. Quite a radical book, certainly from a New York Times economics correspondent. I remember he particularly went after Mark Benioff. I don't suppose Peter has been going on any of Mark Benioff's jets recently, but Peter is back with an interesting new book, How the World Ran Out of Everything Inside the Global Supply Chain. It sounds, at least from the title, a little drier than Davos Man, but I think the two are connected. Peter is joining us from his home in the Hudson Valley in upstate New York. Peter, congratulations on the new book. Are these two books connected? Is this new book volume 2 of the Davos Man, or are they actually books in parallel about the current economic world?
Oh, they're definitely connected. I mean, for a while, I was flippantly referring to this book as Davos Man on the Sea. I mean, there's a lot of monopoly power that goes into explaining how the billionaire class has managed to amass so much wealth and use that wealth to amass political power, and then use that political power to sort of tilt policy in its favor. That's the last book, Davos Man. This book looks specifically at the supply chain, where there is a lot of impact from some of the corporate practices that I described in Davos Man, the financialization, in particular. This explains why the American market is dependent upon this lightly regulated international cartel that runs global shipping and that dominates shipping across the Pacific. So factory goods that are coming in from Asia to the West Coast of the United States. I mean, the two ports at Los Angeles and Long Beach are the gateway to roughly 40% of the imports that come in by container ship. And the reason why prices could go up so dramatically in the space of a few months during the worst of the pandemic is because we just don't have any other choices. This book is about exposing the consequences of us being dependent upon this rickety ad hoc supply chain that's dominated by monopoly interests.
I want to get to the details of what exactly and when exactly we ran out of everything, at least according to you. But are you suggesting then that, and there was a piece about you in The Nation recently, your argument suggests that it's the poor, the less powerful, who were most affected by all these shortages, all this scarcity?
Well, sure. I mean, anytime there's a shock, the people who are most vulnerable, the ones who suffer the most. But the supply chain crisis hit everybody. I mean, to be in the richest, most powerful country on earth and not have personal protective gear, to not even have
Even your friend Mark Benioff, I don't suppose he was particularly
I
affected.
think Mark Benioff was okay. One of my 5 primary characters in the last book. He wrote out the pandemic mostly at his waterfront place on the Big Island of Hawaii, while saying lots of things about how it hit us all equally. I think if you're in the billionaire class and you're living on your own island, in many cases, you got your own jet, you got yachts, you do have resources that the rest of us don't have. But just about everybody faced the shortages that went along with the supply chain disruptions of this pandemic. I mean, my own family was living in London under quarantine. We had it pretty good. We had outdoor space. My wife and I could both work from home, but we had a baby born in April of 2020. And we couldn't get hand sanitizer. We couldn't get the ingredients to make our own hand sanitizer. And this, on top of all the other disruptions from the pandemic, was just kind of cosmically bewildering. And it gave you this sense that the whole world was out of whack.
Yeah, I like the way you put that. Cosmically bewildering. I might put that in the title, Peter. So is this book about COVID, about what happened in COVID, or is COVID somehow accidental? Did the world run out of everything during COVID? Is that what happened?
Well, COVID was the thing that exposed the vulnerabilities that had been there all along. There's a lot of engineered scarcity in the supply chain because when there's limited competition and you've got a dominant hold on the market and something happens to disrupt supply, that is an opportunity to jack up prices. And there's no transparency. So consumers get, okay, shipping prices are way up. Okay, truck drivers are in short supply. Rail service is disrupted because there aren't enough people to maintain the tracks or drive the trains. We get that prices are going to go up, but if you're in a market with no competition, you don't have to worry about somebody coming in to provide the good or service that you're supplying at a lower cost. Then you can just jack up the prices with abandon. And I mean, we saw shipping companies increase the cost of moving a container from China to the West Coast of the States roughly tenfold in the space of just a few months. And the knock-on effects of that, prices for everything goes up. And this inflation is still very much with
Yeah, I take your point, but isn't that different, Peter, from the rise in prices, scarcity from actually running out of everything? Or did we not really run out of anything, and that just suppliers, shipping companies, other manufacturers used this as an excuse to raise their prices?
Yeah, it's both. I mean, look, we ran out of some things. I mean, the title is playful. We certainly ran out of vital things like computer chips, which meant that we ran out of ventilators and medical devices and cars. I mean, I follow one container from a factory town in China, Ningbo, across the Pacific to a warehouse in Mississippi. These are, plastic light up novelty cubes, and the guy whose business I was tracking, a company called Glow in Mississippi, had gotten the most important contract in the history of his startup company. He was making these bath toys for Sesame Street, and he was discovering that there were all sorts of plastics that he couldn't get. There were electronic components that were hard to find. So it's a little of both, but the threat of running out of things makes businesses really anxious, and they're willing to pay whatever it costs to lock in contracts to move goods. And consumers start hoarding things. I mean, we didn't actually run out of toilet paper, but if you went to the store and you couldn't find it, you effectively ran out of toilet paper because everyone else was nervous that we wouldn't be able to get a supply.
Yeah, no, the Wall Street Journal ran the obligatory shopper with all sorts of things in its review of your book. How much does this reflect our own irrationality, Peter? Did we drive a lot of these scarcities because of our paranoia about going to the local store and buying up as many rolls of toilet paper as we could find?
Yeah, I'm not big on criticizing people for supposed paranoia. I mean, this pandemic was frightening, and the science was evolving, and we didn't know how it spread at first. We didn't know how nervous to be. I mean, as somebody whose wife was pregnant with in the first wave of the pandemic, I was not all that eager to go out into stores. I don't think it was irrational. I think that forecasters got the dynamics of the pandemic economy wildly wrong. So there was this assumption once the quarantines were imposed that a lot of people were going to lose their jobs. That was going to take spending power out of the economy. And given that people weren't going into offices, all these restaurants that cater to people in offices would lose business. So it looked like a classic economic downturn. So people in control of companies slashed their orders for just about everything. And that was colossally wrong. So it turns out, we're not going to the gym, but we don't stop exercising. We buy exercise bikes and we put them in our basement. We're not going to restaurants, but we're still feeding families. I mean, personally, I'm making 9 meals a day for cooped up children. That requires, kitchen appliances. We want gizmos to entertain our kids. We want trampolines if we're lucky enough to have backyards. We're outfitting our bedrooms into offices. So all of this stuff, computer monitors, desk chairs, it's coming in from factories largely across the Pacific and especially China. And the whole system buckles under this unexpected surge of goods.
How is this different, though, Peter, from other booms and busts, other economic booms and busts? The Zoom price went up. We had massive increase in the valuation of online bike exercise companies. And all that went on for about 2 or 3 years, and then the market made sense of it, and now everything's back to normal, or it seems to be back to normal, or is that
Well,
the wrong
it's
way of thinking of it?
Well, it's not really back to normal. There are lots of things that are still in short supply. I mean, if you go try to renovate your home, you'll discover quickly that you may have to settle for all sorts of things that you might not want. You can't get your shade of paint because chemicals are still in short supply. The knock-on effects of running out of cars for years has thrown the market out of whack. There are still some models that you can't get. One of the reasons why housing is so unaffordable in the US is because we haven't been able to build at the scale that we need. We're short of millions of units of housing. And part of the reason why we can't build it fast enough is because of supply chain problems that are still affecting construction. But, this idea that the market will adjust, that's fine if you don't have monopoly power. If you have monopoly power, then you have barriers to entry, so the market can't just equalize the way your classic, Econ 101 textbook tells you. The other thing is, if you can't get a ventilator in the middle of a pandemic, it's not much consolation. If well, in a couple of years this will all normalize. Moreover, the inflation that we've got could affect, who wins the presidential election in the U.S. in November. That's a huge story that's largely about supply chain disruption.
You're the global economics guy for the New York Times. You travel around a lot. In the way in which this COVID chaos, what you call cosmologically bewildering situation
Yes, said
developed,
cosmically, but more or
cosmically,
less the same.
I've added the
That's
cosmologically,
all right.
cosmically bewildering situation. And I'm speaking generally here, we were presented, I think at least, maybe you can correct me, with the idea that that things were worse or more bewilderingly cosmic in the US than they were in countries like Korea and Germany. Is there any truth to that? Or was the whole world being affected with these scarcities and the breakdown of the global supply chain?
Oh, the whole world's definitely been affected. I mean, the way I stumbled on this story, I was still living in London. I was writing, my approximately 450th story about Brexit and the trade disruptions, as suddenly the United Kingdom is no longer part of the European single market. And I was talking to somebody who was importing stuff, electronics, I think, from Asia in Ireland, and he was telling me that the price of shipping goods had gone up, I think at that point sevenfold in the space of a few months. And at first I thought that was a Brexit thing. No, that was this. There was a supposed shortage of shipping containers. The shipping containers were in the wrong places, and that was allowing shipping carriers to charge pretty much whatever they wanted. We saw shortages of all sorts of things. I mean, fertilizer in West Africa and Southeast Asia. Some of this is now related to the Russia-Ukraine war. This is post-pandemic. But some of it is just the residual effect of shipping being out of whack. By the way, we're seeing these problems right now. The Houthis in Yemen are opening fire on container vessels and other ships that are in the Red Sea headed toward the Suez Canal, which is a vital artery of trade for goods principally coming from Asia, going to Europe and to the East Coast of the States. And we've got shipping prices now rising, not quite to the level that they were in the worst of the pandemic, but they're getting there. And the result of that is, once again, companies are ordering well ahead of schedule, worrying about getting their stuff into their warehouses in time for the holiday shopping season. We're still very much in this, and it is a global phenomenon.
But did some countries, perhaps with stronger, more regulated states, Korea or Germany or Japan, perhaps, or even China, did they deal or have they dealt with this crisis better than neoliberal places like the United States and the United Kingdom?
Unfortunately, the global supply chain doesn't really distinguish between your guiding ideology. So much of the globe is dependent upon manufactured goods in China for the simple reason that that's just been cheap and reliable. So by and large, the shortages have been a global phenomenon. I mean, in places where there's more industrial policy and where there's more manufacturing going on locally, such as Germany and South Korea, there's a bit more of a buffer than in countries like Britain and the U.S., which have largely relinquished their manufacturing to this China-centric globalization. But yeah, there's not much distinction, because this concept I write about in the book, just in time, pioneered by Toyota at the end of the Second World War, it was a sensible idea. You don't just build everything willy-nilly. You make as much product as you need to replenish what you've already sold. This becomes, thanks to consultancies like McKinsey, this kind of crude imperative for the investor class to just slash inventory and take the savings. Instead of sticking a warehouse full of parts or products you might need if something bad happens, you save the cost and you give it to yourselves through executive compensation. You give it to shareholders through dividends and share buybacks, which make share prices go up. But we head into the pandemic with very little backup plan, and anytime there's a shock, we see shortages. And the pandemic was not the first time, but it was the most profound time.
Economic disorder. Peter S. Goodman's an expert on that. He covers it for the New York Times. He has a new book out covering what's happened, especially since COVID, how the world ran out of everything. How the world ran out of everything inside the global supply chain. I want to thank our friends at Disorder, an excellent new podcast about political disorder. Peter's an expert on economic disorder. They help us, particularly Jason Pack, bring us such great guests as Peter Goodman. He's also the type of guest I think they get on their Disorder podcast. Going to run a short feature on disorder, and then we'll be back with Peter Goodman to talk about what this tells us about free trade and globalization in the 21st century. So don't go away, anyone. We'll be back in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And we are back with Peter S. Goodman, the author of How the World Ran Out of Everything. Peter, what about the macro side of this? Your book got a nice review, surprise, surprise, I guess, in the New York Times, which you also write for. And it was a review of two books, one about the World Trade Center demonstrations, and your book was Global Trade a Mistake. And as it happens, the book about the World Trade Organization demonstrations in Seattle in 1999, an oral history, 1 week to change the world. We had its author, D.W. Gibson, on the show last week. So what are the macro elements here? What does it tell us about the failure, perhaps, of a globalized economy?
Well, it tells us that we've overdone something that's a good thing. I think it would be a real mistake to take away from my book that trade is a mistake. Trade has been enormously beneficial to people around the world. First of all, for China, it's been the greatest source of poverty alleviation in history. But I think, for American consumers, it's been a source of low prices, greater consumer choice. If you work for a company that exports, your wages tend to be higher than those that don't. The failure has been in cushioning the people who are negatively affected. I mean, anytime you talk about trade, there are winners and there are losers. The winners tend to be very diffuse. Anybody who's stepped foot inside a retail store and has paid a few pennies or sometimes dollars less for a piece of clothing or sporting goods or whatever is a beneficiary of trade. The people who are the losers are much more concentrated and much more profoundly affected. I mean, you go to deindustrialized areas, certainly in the industrial Midwest in the U.S., in the north of England, in parts of Italy that have been affected by competition with China. And by the way, this back to this overlap with my previous book, Davos Man: How the Billionaires Devoured the World. It's not an accident that those deindustrialized economies are then the source of great discontent that sets them up for political opportunists like the people who delivered Brexit, like Donald Trump, like the extreme right in Italy, now in France, who are promising, very simplistic solutions to very real problems. So our failure with trade has been to cushion the blow and to share the bounty of trade more widely.
I think you sidestepped that question a bit, Peter. I mean, is the jury still out on globalization? A lot of people were very critical, for example, of NAFTA at the time. Some people suggest that it's undermined the Democratic Party more than the Republican one in the US. What does it tell us about these free trade deals? Or these free trade deals exist in a separate category to the just-in-time networks that you write about, and with or without NAFTA and all these other trade deals, the economy still works the same?
Well, the thing is, I don't think you can disentangle trade policy from lots of other forms of policy, like competition policy, like labor. In a country like Sweden, where there's national health care and where education is affordable, and where people who lose jobs have very effective job training and help with their income and their housing if need be, trade is not the wrenching experience that it tends to be in a winner-take-all society like the U.S. I think in terms of the message of NAFTA, China entering the WTO, the issue is not so much that we engaged in trade and global integration. I don't think globalization had to be the disaster that it's been for significant numbers of people. And it really has been a consumer bonanza for the vast majority of people. The problem is that if you allow financialization, if you allow shareholder interest to dictate the rest of your policies, then you get what we've got, which is widening inequality, which is some workers who are totally abandoned. And so our consumer gains come at the expense of communities that are absolutely decimated. That's what we've got, but it didn't have to be that way. I mean, if we had antitrust enforcement to go along with our trade policies, if we had policies that had limited things like shareholder buybacks, if we'd had investors not simply focused on the next quarter, I think now there's a sort of false narrative between efficiency versus resilience. A lot of people are saying we overdid it with just in time. We need to do just in case. Well, the kind of efficiency that we've had that's encapsulated in our trade policy is full of crazy inefficiencies. I mean, we could go on at length, but I tell the story of how the railroads, which are essentially duopolies in the U.S., were sending cargo to the wrong places because Wall Street just wanted to lower dwell time. That was the metric that they cared about. That's how long cargo sits in any given place. And so you had people in rail yards just attaching rail cars to the next train out, no matter where it went, so they could lower dwell time. If we had fixed some of these policies, our trade policies wouldn't look like the disasters that they do.
So you're not in the Trump camp, or for that matter, the Biden camp, when it comes to disentangling, I'm not sure if that's the right word, the U.S. economy from the Chinese one. This is a separate conversation from the one you deal with in this new book.
Well, no. Look, I point out in the book that it's crazy to depend upon a single country, and especially one that we happen to be having a trade war with, for the vast majority of our basic our basic chemicals for medicines, for personal protective gear. That's bananas. We shouldn't have done that. We should diversify away. But the problem is that, the Trump camp would say, well, we just need to bring the supply chains back to the U.S. Let's make everything in the U.S. That's a fantasy. That's simply going to be very wrenching in the immediate term. We should bring some stuff back, and the Biden policy to focus on areas that are strategically significant, like computer chips, like electric vehicles. That seems perfectly sensible. But those things are only going to happen with subsidies and direct grants of tens of billions of dollars to encourage companies to set up shop. The more realistic proposition is the one that I explore in the book, which is instead of spending 90% of your sourcing in China, if you're a multinational company, like take Walmart, they're now looking aggressively in places like India. They're moving some business to Mexico so that if anything goes wrong in one particular part of the globe, you can still get your supplies from elsewhere. And it's also healthy to once again think about place. I mean, the kind of globalization that we've had has encouraged us to not give a thought to where our stuff's made. A factory in Ohio is, for all intents and purposes, the same as a factory in southern China, because we take for granted that container shipping is free and reliable. And as long as workers are working cheaply somewhere, we don't have to worry about it. Well, my book exposes that we've got this whole army of unseen workers, some on the other side of oceans, some right in our own countries, who are responsible for getting our stuff made and to our doors. And we better think about them. And place does matter. So better to move some of our production closer to where we actually need things.
Peter, think about this out loud. Was there a miraculous quality to this just-in-time economy? The idea that you could order something online or offline, and it would be delivered to your door sometimes within a day, and the same existed on in the B2B economy. Are things just returning to normal? Should we expect just-in-time to ever work?
Look, just-in-time has worked. I mean, it works very well. The question is, how much insurance do you want? Look, you can sit in your own home and have no insurance, and for decades you might not regret it. But when a tree falls on the roof and something bad will eventually happen, you're going to want insurance. And that's the way to think about where we make things. China is highly efficient. For reasons that can tend to be unsavory. The greatest joint venture in the history of global capitalism is that between Walmart, the world's largest retailer, and the People's Republic of China. Why is Walmart there? Why have they built up a global procurement center that I visited 20 years ago in Shenzhen? Because labor unions are basically banned, because workplace safety standards, environmental standards, can be bypassed if you cut in a local Communist Party official who can get you what you need. The exchange rate is basically set by the government. So these are the elements that brought so much production to China. The question is, do you want to avail yourself of those benefits and also have a little bit of insurance against the inevitable shocks? We had conversations after the Fukushima nuclear disaster back in 2011, 2012, that maybe it wasn't such a great idea to concentrate so much of the computer chip making capacity in Japan and other electronics. We had lots of shortages. First supply chain disruption story I ever wrote was in 1999 when there was an earthquake in Taiwan. There were people then saying, maybe we shouldn't depend on this one island that happens to be 90 miles off the coast of China, a country that claims Taiwan as part of its own territory. We should diversify. At every step, this stuff got tuned out because the people running publicly traded companies are thinking about the next quarter. And when you talk about diversifying away from Taiwan or China, you're talking about adding cost, you're talking about adding complexity, and the shareholder wants the best things for the next quarter right now. That incentive is still in place. So I'm not so sure that there is anything different about this shock. The further away we get from the pandemic, the more reason there is to believe that the lowest price will again prevail. And we, society, will be on the hook for what happens the next time there is inevitably another shock.
Are you really saying, Peter, that American capitalism, Wall Street capitalism, doesn't work?
No. I think Wall Street capitalism works great. If you want cheap blue jeans and T-shirts, Wall Street style capitalism is a great way to go, but it requires regulation. This fantasy of the free market is just that, a fantasy. There always have to be watchdogs and regulators to look out for the public good. We live in what's supposed to be a democracy. We're supposed to have a say over reliable working conditions. Look, this goes all the way back to Henry Ford. Henry Ford back in 1914, doubled the wages of his workforce, paid $5 an hour in 1914. People called him a communist for doing that at the time. He said, no, I'm a capitalist. I'm just trying to make my products reliably at scale. And any business that's premised on that's dependent on low wage labor is inherently unreliable. And the same applies to entrusting so much of our productive capacity to the cheapest producer at any given moment. Capitalism is what we've got. Capitalism gives us innovation. It gives us choice. It needs sensible regulations in order to function so that we don't get screwed when there's a shock.
Are there equivalents, Peter, of Henry Ford today? Entrepreneurs, innovators who get it, and who are, borrowing a word from you, insuring their companies against these future shocks?
Well, Toyota, which originated just in time, actually came out better in these supply chain disruptions than just about any other auto company, because they did not listen to McKinsey and entrust their supply chains to container ships and oceans. They stuck with the tenets of just-in-time manufacturing from inception, which is you got to have your suppliers clustered close to your factories. If you're counting on the magic of the internet and forever cheap, reliable container shipping, and never mind that it's an international cartel and we're all at the mercy of it, that is a prescription for running out of stuff when something bad happens. The positive sort of irony of this is that as some multinational companies start to entrust their production to factories in Mexico, there is any place in Mexico is no further than 2 weeks away from any place in North America. That actually allows you to do just in time in a more responsible way. I mean, if you run out of something, you can more quickly replenish it because you're not waiting weeks and weeks for a vessel to cross the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah, we did. I can't remember the name of the author, but a year or two ago, we did a show with an economist who argued that the world, the economy is no longer global. It's regional. You mentioned the
Rana
internet.
Forahar. Was that Rana Forahar, Homecoming?
Rana's been on the show.
Yeah.
I don't think that. I think there was another book, another economist, but basically they're all making the same argument. Peter, you mentioned the internet, of course, the equivalence supposedly of the Henry Ford of the 21st century, and men like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. Are the digital entrepreneurs, are they doing it right or wrong? Are they simply milking the system?
I mean, they're doing it right from the standpoint of the people they work for, and that's their shareholders for the most part. I mean, if you take Bezos, Bezos was not providing PPE to his own warehouse workers in the middle of a pandemic while saying publicly, I can't get hold of PPE because it's all made in China.
Right, and trying to ban unions.
And banning unions. Yeah, of course, his workers noticed, we seem to have PPE for the people who are paying for it because we're putting it in boxes. This is the subject of my last book, right? We are crazy to think that unregulated billionaires are going to solve all of our societal problems. If you want to build a car cheaply, if you want to build an amazing and vibrant e-commerce network, the billionaire class is very good at that, and we benefit. This is not to demonize them. This is to discard the idea that absent regulations, the social good will be protected.
Finally, Peter, what about the chances of this happening again? Maybe there'll be another COVID epidemic. Hopefully not, but some people suggest that's fairly inevitable in the long run. You've addressed another crisis of the global supply chain. Is this first one that happened over the last few years? Is it a warning? Is it a mini quake before the big one?
I don't know if it's a mini quake before the big one, but it's definitely a sign of what will inevitably happen. Look, again, as we speak, shipping prices are up dramatically from their supposed recovery to normal because the Houthis are opening fire on ships entering the Red Sea, destined for the Suez Canal. We've had low water levels in the Panama Canal, so ships have been heavily restricted passing through the Panama Canal. We've got dock workers striking in Germany. We've got the threat of a dock worker strike on the East Coast of the United States. We've got the threat of a rail strike in Canada that could be quite crippling. I mean, these are shocks to the supply chain itself. And we certainly can't dismiss the idea there could be a natural disaster, a tsunami somewhere, another pandemic. We don't know when any of these things will happen, but we know with certainty that they will happen eventually. And the question is, have we built our supply chain largely for the benefit of big box retailers and their shareholder interests, or have we built our supply chain with the interests of the rest of us in mind? You know, as a London Business School professor put it to me, you know, if you run out of ventilators in the middle of a pandemic because you've overdone it with just in time and you simply don't have the capacity to make a ventilator when you need one, you don't get to say to society, well, at least our share price is high. And that situation is still in play. And when inevitably the next shock materializes, we will run out of things again unless we change the incentives.
So when this shock happens, Peter, you seem to be suggesting that the answer isn't economic, it's political, more regulation, different kinds of regulation.
Well, that is economic. I mean, you simply can't divorce the idea of regulation from the economy. There is no economy without regulation.
No, I understand that, but you're suggesting that the political thinking is somehow out of whack, that people aren't recognizing what you're seeing. How could this play out in politics? When will this begin to percolate down into the political sphere? As you note, we've got Trump screaming and shouting about the Chinese, Biden mumbling about the Chinese, but neither of them make a lot of sense. Is it conceivable that if there is another bigger shock and it really affects us dramatically without another COVID epidemic, that this may play out in political terms and spark new political movements, new political thinking?
Well, I guess I would push back on the premise. I mean, I think Biden's presidency is in large part a reaction to some hard lessons that we learned during the pandemic. And I mean, we can quibble over the details, but there's a very different trade policy under Biden. Biden has embraced industrial policy, and his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, says routinely that supply chains are a matter of national security, and that the old days of simply assuming that scouring the globe for the lowest cost provider of goods was a good way to go, you know, that's over. And we now do have to think about where we're making things. So I think we've already entered that new era. The question is whether the shareholder interests will prevail or whether the pressures that have been unleashed for companies to go and limit their dependence upon the Chinese supply chain in particular, whether that will stick. And there, I'm not so sure.
So you're saying, Peter, really that if you don't want the world to run out of everything again, you should vote for Joe Biden in the next election?
No, I'm not saying that. But I am saying that you have to think about where things are made. We should embrace labor mobilization. The fact that working people are earning more tends toward the good in terms of reliability of services. I mean, one of the reasons why we ran out of truck drivers, and I'm putting that in air quotes, one of the reasons why we ran out of people to work in warehouses is because we've over decades just so downgraded these jobs and have made them so untenable and unappealing. I mean, I rode with a truck driver for 3 days through the midsection of the U.S. in the middle of January 2022, and came away with the unmistakable reality that if you got another way to make a living, you're going to do it. And unless we address that, then whenever there's a shock again, we'll run out of workers. People will go find other stuff to do. That's real resilience. So I think we should welcome those sorts of developments.
And AI won't change any of this. Some people think that AI will create this cornucopia, this abundance of everything.
I mean, AI and other forms of technology, I mean, automation, robotics, I mean, they can give us greater intelligence about shifts that are happening in real time so we can adjust faster. We can certainly limit our dependence upon people doing dangerous stuff through robotics and automation. But unless we treat people decently, unless we give people a stake in the system, we will inevitably run out of people again when there's a crisis. And, I do hope, if nothing else, somebody who reads my book will never again drive by a truck or look at a package landing on their door in the same way. There's this whole unseen army of people we're depending on, and we ought to be thinking about them as we make policy.
Well, Peter S. Goodman, the author of How the World Ran Out of Everything. Honored to have you back on the show. I think one thing we can say for sure is the world's not going to run out of you. Peter S. Goodman will be around again, and have to get you back, Peter, on the show when you come out with a new book. Thank you so much.